Story number 1.
When we moved into the house, it was the kind of place I'd dreamed about for years. A two-story colonial-style home tucked into a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. It was November 2017. My husband Ethan and I had saved for years to afford a home like this, and finally it was ours. The house felt warm, even in the cold grip of late autumn, and the previous owners had left it spotless. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Our 8-year-old daughter, Lily, loved her new room, which had a window that overlooked the backyard and its massive oak tree. We quickly settled into our routines, unpacking boxes and filling the empty walls with photos and paintings. But then, little things started to happen. It began with the basement. I'd never liked it, even from the first walkthrough. The air down there felt damp despite the dehumidifier. The single bulb in the center of the ceiling didn't do much to fight the shadows. Every time I went down to do laundry, I'd get this uncomfortable feeling like someone was watching me. One night, as I was folding clothes on the basement table, I thought I heard footsteps above me in the kitchen. Assuming it was Ethan or Lily, I yelled, "Can you grab me a drink while you're up there?" No response. When I finished and came back upstairs, the kitchen was empty. Ethan was in the living room, glued to his laptop, and Lily was fast asleep. "Did you go into the kitchen earlier?" I asked him. He shook his head without looking up. "Nope, why?" I didn't press it. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. Then there was the door to the attic. It was a small, square panel in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. I hadn't even noticed it until one night when I was tucking Lily into bed. She pointed to the hallway and said, "Why is the door open?" I turned and saw the attic panel had been pushed upward, leaving a dark, yawning gap in the ceiling. My stomach dropped. "Ethan," I called. He came upstairs, and I pointed at the open attic. He frowned. "I haven't touched it." Using a broomstick, he nudged the panel back into place. But I didn't sleep well that night, and I started to feel uneasy in the house. A week later, Lily woke us up at 3 a.m., crying. She said she'd seen someone standing in the corner of her room. Ethan went to check, but there was no one there. "It was probably a shadow," he said, trying to calm her and me down. But Lily insisted it was a woman, dressed in black. After that, she refused to sleep in her room alone. We let her sleep in our bed for a while, but Ethan insisted we couldn't let her fear take over. We compromised by leaving her door open and a nightlight on. The activity escalated. We'd hear faint whispers at night, always coming from different parts of the house. Things would go missing, a mug, a book, a pair of shoes, only to turn up in the strangest places, like inside the pantry or under the couch. The worst happened one evening in late December. I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. Lily was in the living room, drawing, and Ethan was upstairs. I heard the front door open and close, followed by heavy footsteps. "Ethan?" I called out, assuming he'd come downstairs. No answer. I walked into the living room, but no one was there except Lily. She looked up at me, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, "there's someone in the hallway." I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the hallway. A dark figure stood at the far end, just outside the basement door. It was tall, with no discernible features, just a dense shadow that seemed to suck the light out of the space around it. I grabbed Lily and bolted into the kitchen, slamming the door behind us. My hands were shaking as I locked it. Ethan came running down the stairs, alarmed by the noise. When I told him what we'd seen, he immediately searched the house, but there was no one there. After that night, I couldn't take it anymore. I started researching the history of the house. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The house had belonged to a woman named Margaret Hayes in the 1970s. She was a recluse, known for her strange behavior. Rumor had it that she practiced witchcraft and had a habit of standing in her front window at odd hours, staring out at nothing. In 1979, she was found dead in the basement. The cause of death was ruled as a heart attack, but neighbors said she'd been clutching an old, tattered book in her hands when they found her. I showed Ethan the article, but he dismissed it. "Old houses have weird histories," he said. "That doesn't mean anything." But it felt like Margaret's presence was still here, and it was growing stronger. The final straw came in January 2018. We were sitting in the living room one evening, watching a movie, when Lily screamed. She was staring at the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "She's right there!" she cried. She's staring at us. Ethan and I saw nothing, but Lily was inconsolable. That night I told Ethan we needed to leave. We stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks while we searched for a new place. I didn't care about the financial loss or the inconvenience. I just wanted out. We sold the house in March 2018 at a loss. I didn't tell the new owners about Margaret or the strange events. I told myself it was because I didn't want to scare them. But the truth was, I didn't want to think about it anymore. We moved into a smaller, newer house on the other side of town. It didn't have the charm of the old one, but it was quiet, peaceful. And that was all I wanted. I never saw Margaret again, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear whispers. Story the end.
Story number 2.
In August of 2016, we finally moved into our new house. It was everything we had hoped for. A cozy 2-story craftsman-style home just outside of Seattle. My husband Mark and I were excited to leave our cramped apartment behind and start fresh with our 3-year-old son Daniel. The house wasn't old, maybe built in the early 90s, but it had a certain character that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt lived in. The first few weeks were chaotic but uneventful. We unpacked, painted, and set up Daniel's room with all his favorite toys. He loved his new space, especially the bay window where he could sit and watch the trees sway in the backyard. Everything felt perfect, and I was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief after months of house hunting and stress. Then, about a month in, strange things began happening. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Lights would flicker randomly, but only in certain rooms. The hallway light, in particular, seemed to have a mind of its own. Mark joked that it was probably faulty wiring, but when we called an electrician, they couldn't find anything wrong. One evening, as I was putting Daniel to bed, he looked up at me with his wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Mommy, who's the lady in the hallway?" My heart stopped. "What lady, sweetie?" "The one who stands by the door at night," he said matter-of-factly. I forced a smile. "There's no lady, Daniel. You must have been dreaming." But his words stayed with me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any unusual sounds. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Over the next few weeks, Daniel kept mentioning the lady. He said she had long hair and wore a dress. Once, he told me she had tried to talk to him, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. Mark brushed it off as a child's overactive imagination, but I wasn't so sure. One night in October, I was cleaning up after dinner while Mark gave Daniel his bath. I was alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, when I heard it. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV in the living room, but when I walked in, the TV was off. I stood there, heart pounding, straining to hear. The whisper came again, soft and indistinct, like someone was speaking from far away. "Mark?" I called, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, but I could hear him upstairs with Daniel. I was about to dismiss it as my imagination when I felt it, a cold breeze brushing past me. The windows were closed, and there was no draft. I turned and saw nothing, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone had been standing right behind me. After that night, the activity in the house escalated. Like we'd hear footsteps on the stairs late at night, even though we were all in bed. Doors would creak open on their own, and objects would disappear, only to reappear in strange places. The worst part was Daniel. He started waking up in the middle of the night, screaming. When I'd rush into his room, he'd be sitting up in bed, pointing to the corner and crying, "She's here! She's here!" Mark and I were at a loss. We tried everything. Night lights, keeping his door open, even letting him sleep with us. But nothing seemed to help. One night I decided to stay up late and watch the hallway from the living room, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was terrifying Daniel. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glow of the street lamp outside. At around 2 a.m., I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I watched a shadow pass by the doorway. I wanted to call out, but fear paralyzed me. I stayed frozen, clutching the blanket on the couch as the shadow lingered in the doorway for what felt like an eternity before moving on. The next morning, I told Mark what I'd seen. He looked concerned, but still tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it was a trick of the light," he said, "or maybe you were half asleep." But I knew what I'd seen. Desperate for answers, I started digging into the history of the house. What I found left me shaken. The house had been owned by a woman named Eleanor Wilson in the late 1990s. She was a school teacher, quiet and well-liked by her neighbors. But in 2002, she went missing. No one ever found her body, but her car was discovered abandoned a few miles away. Her disappearance remained unsolved, and many locals believed she had been murdered. I couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor was still here, trapped in the house where she had once lived. The final straw came in December. It was a cold, rainy night, and Mark had gone out to run an errand. Daniel was asleep upstairs, and I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I ran in and found the cabinet doors wide open, all the dishes scattered across the floor. My heart raced as I turned to look at the hallway. She was there. A figure stood at the far end, barely visible in the dim light. She was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and a tattered dress. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, empty pits. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before vanishing into the shadows. When Mark came home, I was in tears, trying to explain what had happened. That night, I made the decision. We had to leave. We put the house on the market the following week. It took months to sell, and we ended up taking a significant loss. But I didn't care. March 2017, we had moved into a small apartment downtown. I never told the new owners about Eleanor or what we had experienced. Part of me felt guilty, but another part of me just wanted to forget. It's been years since we left, but sometimes late at night, I still hear whispers in the dark. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
In September 2018, we moved into our new house, a cozy split level on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for our little family. I'd been excited to get out of our cramped apartment and give our 6-year-old son, Lucas, a backyard to play in. My husband, Chris, and I had worked hard to save for it, and finally we had a place to call our own. The house had been vacant for almost a year, though the realtor assured us it was in great condition. From the moment I stepped inside, something felt different. Not bad, just odd. I chalked it up to the fact that the house was unfamiliar and empty. It would feel like home soon enough, or so I thought. The first night was peaceful. We ate pizza on the floor of the living room, surrounded by boxes. Lucas was thrilled about his new room, which had a large window overlooking the woods behind the house. He spent most of the evening exploring, running up and down the stairs with boundless energy. It wasn't until a few days later that I started to notice strange things. At first, it was little stuff. The faucet in the upstairs bathroom would be running when no one had used it. Lights flickered occasionally, but only in the hallway near Lucas's room. Chris shrugged it off, blaming it on faulty wiring or old pipes. One night, as I was tucking Lucas into bed, he looked up at me and asked, "Mommy, who's the man in the corner?" My stomach dropped. I turned my head, scanning the corner of his room, but there was nothing there. "What man, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The man with the hat. He stands there at night," Lucas said, matter-of-factly. I forced a smile. "You must have been dreaming. There's no man here." Lucas didn't argue, but he looked unconvinced. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might explain what he had said. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood. The next morning, I mentioned it to Chris. He laughed it off, saying, "Kids have wild imaginations. It's probably just shadows from the trees outside his window." I wanted to believe him, but something about Lucas's calm certainty unsettled me. As the weeks went by, more unexplainable things happened. Doors would creak open on their own, even when we knew they were shut tight. Lucas started waking up in the middle of the night, crying and saying that the man had been standing closer to his bed. One evening, Chris and I were in the living room, watching TV, when we heard a loud thud from upstairs. We both jumped and ran up to check on Lucas. He was fast asleep, but one of his toy cars was in the middle of the hallway, far from where he had been playing earlier. "I swear I put all his toys away." I whispered to Chris. "You probably just missed one," he replied, but his tone lacked conviction. The breaking point came in November. Chris was out of town for work, and it was just Lucas and me in the house. It was a rainy, cold night, and the wind howled through the trees outside. I had just put Lucas to bed and was downstairs folding laundry when I heard it. A loud, deliberate knock on the front door. My heart raced as I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. Maybe it's the wind, I muttered to myself, though I didn't really believe it. I turned to head back to the laundry when I heard another knock, this time from the back door. Grabbing my phone, I called Chris. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just the weather or an animal. But then Lucas screamed. I dropped the phone and bolted up the stairs to his room. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror, pointing at the corner. "He's here." Lucas sobbed. "He's standing right there." I couldn't see anything, but the air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. I grabbed Lucas and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind us. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, the lights on. The next day, I called a neighbor who had lived on the street for years. I hesitated before asking, "Do you know anything about the previous owners of our house?" Her expression shifted, and she lowered her voice. "You mean you didn't know? The man who lived there before, he died in the house. It was tragic. He was a recluse, always wearing this old fedora, and people said he wasn't quite right. They found him in one of the upstairs rooms. Heart attack, I think. But, well, some folks around here say his spirit never left." A chill ran down my spine. Lucas's description of the man with the hat suddenly made sense. I didn't tell Chris about the conversation, but I became more and more convinced that we weren't alone in the house. I started leaving all the lights on at night and even burned sage, though I wasn't sure if it would help. By December, Chris finally admitted he was starting to feel uneasy too. He said he'd been hearing faint whispers at night, like someone talking just out of earshot. We agreed to put the house on the market, even though we hadn't lived there long. The night before we moved out, something happened that I'll never forget. I was packing boxes in the living room when I felt it, an overwhelming sense of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and the room grew unnaturally cold. I turned around, and for the briefest moment, I saw him, a tall man in a faded suit and fedora, standing in the doorway to the hallway. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark and empty. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stared at me. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The next day, we left the house for good. I didn't tell Lucas or Chris what I had seen, but I could tell Chris was just as eager to leave as I was. We sold the house in January 2019, taking a financial hit, but I didn't care. We moved into a modern apartment in the city, far from the woods, and life slowly returned to normal. Every now and then, Lucas asks about the man with the hat. I always tell him we left him behind in the old house. But sometimes, late at night, when the lights are off and the apartment is quiet, I think I hear faint footsteps in the hallway. Story the end.
Story number 4.
In the summer of 2017, we moved into what we thought was our dream home. It was a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Portland, Oregon. My husband Eric and I were excited to finally give our 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, a yard to play in. The previous owners had sold it quickly, and though the price seemed almost too good to be true, we chalked it up to luck. From the moment we stepped inside, the house felt strange. It wasn't immediately obvious, more of a background hum of discomfort. Sophie, however, seemed unfazed. She loved her new bedroom, especially the built-in bookshelf that sat beneath a large window overlooking the backyard. For the first week, everything was fine. We unpacked, painted, and made the house our own. But as the days passed, I began to notice little things. Lights would flicker in the upstairs hallway, even though Eric insisted the electrical work had been inspected before we moved in. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be slightly ajar, and the house seemed colder than it should have been, even on warm days. One evening, while Sophie was playing in her room, she called out, "Mommy, can I have a snack for the lady?" I stopped in my tracks. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The one in my room," she said casually. "She's sitting by the bookshelf." I walked into her room, my heart pounding, but of course there was no one there. Sophie just shrugged when I asked her to explain and went back to playing with her dolls. That night, I told Eric about it. He laughed, brushing it off as her imagination. "She's probably just getting used to the new place," he said. But the idea unsettled me. Over the next few weeks, Sophie kept mentioning the lady. She said the woman had long hair and wore an old-fashioned dress. Sophie wasn't afraid of her. If anything, she seemed comforted by her presence. Things escalated in early September. I started hearing faint knocking sounds at night, always from somewhere upstairs. The sound would echo faintly through the house, but when I went to investigate, I could never find the source. One night, as I was putting Sophie to bed, she whispered, "Mommy, the lady doesn't like Daddy." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "She said he's too loud," Sophie replied, then rolled over and closed her eyes. I didn't sleep well that night. The final straw came a few weeks later. Eric was out of town for work, and I was home alone with Sophie. It was a chilly, rainy evening, and I was in the kitchen making dinner while Sophie played in the living room. Suddenly, she screamed. I dropped the knife I was holding and ran into the living room. Sophie was standing in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. "She's mad, Mommy," she cried. "She's really mad." "What happened?" I asked, scooping her up in my arms. "She was by the bookshelf, but now she's everywhere." Sophie sobbed, burying her face in my shoulder. I felt an icy chill sweep through the room, and for the first time, I felt it too, the heavy, oppressive presence of something watching us. That night, I called Eric and told him we needed to leave. He was hesitant at first, but after I described what had happened, he agreed to cut his trip short and come home. The next day, I spoke to one of our neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Carmichael. She hesitated before answering when I asked about the house's history. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "the woman who lived there before you, she died in the house. Her name was Abigail Turner. She lived alone for years after her husband left her. People said she wasn't all there, you know? She kept to herself, but there were rumors she didn't want anyone else in the house. I guess you could say she was territorial." I felt sick. By the time Eric returned, I had made up my mind. We couldn't stay. I didn't care how much money we'd lose or how inconvenient it would be. I wasn't going to subject Sophie or myself to another day in that house. We sold the house in November, just 3 months after moving in. The new owners were a young couple, and I didn't have the heart to tell them about Abigail. We moved into a small rental downtown, far from the neighborhood, and life slowly returned to normal. Sophie stopped talking about the lady, and the knocking sounds never followed us. But sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I still feel the chill of that house. And occasionally, in the faintest corners of my dreams, I see her, the woman by the bookshelf, watching. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
In the spring of 2019, my husband Jake and I bought a small house in the quiet suburbs of Denver. It was a modest ranch-style home built in the 1970s with a big backyard for our dog Charlie and enough space to start the family we'd been talking about. The previous owner, an older man named Mr. Henson, had passed away in the house, but the realtor assured us everything was in good condition. The price was right, and we felt lucky to have found it. The first week in the house was blissful. We spent our days unpacking and our evenings relaxing on the back porch, watching the sunset. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel off. One night, while Jake was working late, I decided to clean up the basement. It was unfinished but had potential to become a cozy den someday. As I organized boxes, Charlie, who had followed me downstairs, started growling at a dark corner. His hackles were raised, and he let out a low, menacing growl I'd never heard before. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice echoing in the empty space. I flipped on the flashlight on my phone and shone it into the corner. There was nothing there, just shadows and old paint cans. But Charlie wouldn't stop growling until I finally brought him upstairs. Jake laughed it off when I told him. "It's probably mice or something. He's a dog, after all." But the unease lingered. A few nights later, I woke up at 2:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Jake, but when I reached over, he was still in bed, sound asleep. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving toward our bedroom. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, half expecting it to creak open, but the sound stopped just outside, and after a few minutes, the house fell silent again. The next morning, I told Jake what had happened. He was skeptical. "The house is old," he said. "It's probably just the floorboards settling." I tried to convince myself he was right, but over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became impossible to ignore. Lights flickered, even after Jake replaced the bulbs. Doors would creak open, even when I was certain I had closed them. Once, I came home to find every cabinet in the kitchen wide open, though Jake swore he hadn't touched them. The worst was the cold spots. There were areas in the house, mostly in the hallway and the basement, where the air felt icy, no matter how warm the rest of the house was. Walking through them made my skin crawl. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, I heard a faint whisper. It was soft, almost like a sigh, and it seemed to come from right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Charlie, who had been lying on the bed, suddenly jumped down and bolted out of the room, his tail tucked between his legs. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Then Jake experienced it too. Late one night, he was in the kitchen, grabbing a snack, when he saw a shadow move across the living room. At first, he thought it was me, but when he called out, I answered from the bedroom. He came back pale-faced. "I swear I saw something," he said. "It was tall, like a person." From that point on, the activity escalated. The footsteps in the hallway became almost nightly occurrences, always stopping just outside our bedroom door. Objects would go missing and reappear in strange places. Once, we woke up to find all the picture frames in the living room turned backward. One evening, we invited our friend Lisa over. She was a self-proclaimed skeptic and loved horror stories, so we figured she'd find our experiences amusing. As we sat in the living room, recounting the strange events, the overhead lights suddenly flickered violently and went out. Lisa laughed nervously. "Okay, that was weird." Jake went to check the breaker, but everything was fine. When the lights came back on, Lisa's expression had changed. "I felt something," she said quietly, like someone was standing right behind me. The final straw came in July. Jake was working late again, and I was home alone. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a loud crash from the basement. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a flashlight and hesitantly made my way downstairs. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the old paint cans had been knocked over, their lids rolling across the concrete floor. But what froze me in place was the writing on the far wall. In the dust, as if traced by an invisible finger, were the words, "Get out!" I bolted upstairs, locked the door to the basement, and called Jake. He came home immediately, and we spent the night at a hotel. The next day, we decided to do some research on the house. What we found was chilling. Mr. Henson, the previous owner, had been a recluse in his later years, but before that, he had lived there with his wife, Eleanor. According to old news articles, Eleanor had disappeared in the 1980s, and her body was never found. The neighbors had their theories. Some believed Mr. Henson had killed her and hidden her body on the property, though nothing was ever proven. We couldn't stay in the house after that. Within a month, we sold it, taking a financial loss just to be free of the place. We moved into an apartment downtown and tried to put the experience behind us. But sometimes, late at night, I still think, I wonder if Eleanor at house. I wonder Eleanor is still there, wandering the halls, waiting for someone to find her. And I wonder if, in some way, she was trying to warn us or protect us from something even darker. Story the end.
Story number 6.
In the fall of 2016, my husband Matt and I moved into a new house in a small town in upstate New York. We'd been looking for months and finally found a charming 2-story colonial that seemed perfect. It was built in the early 1900s and had the kind of character we loved: creaky hardwood floors, a big wraparound porch, and a clawfoot tub in the bathroom. It needed some work, but we were excited to turn it into our dream home. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, had passed away a year earlier, and her family had put the house on the market. It had been sitting vacant for months, but it seemed solid. The first few weeks were uneventful. We were busy unpacking and tackling small repairs. I was thrilled to finally have a proper office upstairs where I could work on my freelance writing. Matt, a history buff, loved the idea of restoring a piece of the past. But then little things started happening. The first time I didn't think much of it. I was working in my office when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I assumed it was Matt, but when I called out, there was no response. I got up to check, but the stairs were empty, and Matt was still at work. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. A few days later, Matt mentioned hearing strange noises at night, whispers almost, but he brushed it off as the wind. Then came the cold spots. No matter how high we turned up the heat, certain areas of the house were freezing, especially the hallway outside the upstairs bathroom. I'd walk through and feel an icy chill, like stepping into a refrigerator. One night, I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard Matt call my name from upstairs. "Be right there," I called back, drying my hands. But when I went upstairs, Matt wasn't there. He was still outside in the garage, working on a project. I felt a prickle of unease, but decided not to mention it. Things escalated in December. One evening, as we were watching TV in the living room, we heard a loud crash upstairs. We both jumped and ran up to see what had happened. In our bedroom, the closet door was wide open, and a box of clothes we'd stored on the top shelf was on the floor, its contents scattered. "That's weird," Matt said, frowning. "That box was pushed way back. There's no way it could have just fallen." I nodded, my stomach twisting. That night I woke up to the sound of whispers. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone speaking just out of earshot. My heart pounded as I lay there, straining to listen. The whispers stopped, replaced by a creaking sound, like footsteps moving across the floor. "Matt?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He woke with a start, and we both sat in silence, listening. The sound stopped at the foot of our bed. We didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few weeks, the activity became impossible to ignore. Doors opened and closed on their own. Lights flickered, even after Matt rewired the faulty ones. I started feeling like I was being watched, especially when I was alone in the house. The final straw came in January. Matt was out of town for work, and I was home alone. It was snowing heavily, and the house felt eerily quiet. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It was coming from the basement. Grabbing my phone, I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I turned on the light and crept down the stairs. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath. The banging continued, louder now, coming from the far corner of the basement. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The old metal storage cabinet we'd inherited with the house. The doors were rattling violently, as if something inside was trying to get out. My hands trembled as I stepped closer. I hesitated, then yanked the doors open. Nothing. The cabinet was empty. I backed away, heart pounding, and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. The next morning, I called Matt and told him everything. He came home early, and we decided to do some research on the house. What we found left us shaken. Mrs. Hawthorne, the previous owner, had lived in the house for decades. But she wasn't the first. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to a family named the Gallaghers. According to old newspaper clippings, their teenage daughter, Clara, had disappeared one winter night and was never found. Neighbors had whispered about foul play, even pointing fingers at Clara's father, who was known for his temper. But without evidence, the case went cold. Matt and I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's spirit was still there, trapped in the house. By February, we decided we couldn't stay. The house was beautiful, but the constant unease was too much. We sold it to a couple who planned to renovate, leaving behind the whispers, the cold spots, and the heavy feeling that someone or something was always watching. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about that house. I wonder if Clara ever found peace, or if she's still wandering the halls searching for answers. Story the end.
Story number 7.
In the spring of 2018, I moved into a new house with my fiancée, Rachel. It was a small 2-bedroom bungalow on the outskirts of Raleigh, North Carolina. We were both excited to start fresh in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. The house had charm. Hardwood floors, a brick fireplace, and a spacious backyard. It felt like a good place to build a life together. The first few weeks were uneventful. We painted the walls, rearranged furniture, and spent our evenings sitting on the back porch, planning our future. But there were small details about the house that nagged at me. For one, the air always seemed heavy, especially in the hallway that connected the bedrooms to the bathroom. And the previous owners had left behind a few odd things, like an antique mirror in the hallway that Rachel insisted on keeping because it's part of the house's character. I didn't love it. The mirror's surface was slightly warped, and the ornate wooden frame was chipped and darkened with age. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. The first incident happened about a month after we moved in. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Rachel, but when I reached over, she was still lying next to me, fast asleep. The footsteps weren't loud, more like a soft, deliberate creaking of the floorboards. They seemed to come from the hallway. I sat up, my heart racing, and strained to listen. The sound stopped. The next morning, I mentioned it to Rachel, but she shrugged it off. Old houses make weird noises, she said. It's probably just the wood expanding or something. I wanted to believe her. Over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. Lights flickered, even after I replaced the bulbs. Doors creaked open on their own, despite the lack of a draft. I occasionally felt cold spots, especially near the mirror in the hallway. One night, as Rachel and I were getting ready for bed, I noticed her staring at the mirror. "Everything okay?" I asked. She didn't respond at first, then shook her head as if snapping out of a trance. "Yeah, sorry. I thought I saw something move, but it must have been my reflection." Her tone was casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Things escalated quickly after that. Rachel started waking up in the middle of the night, claiming she'd heard whispers. She said it sounded like a woman's voice, soft and pleading, though she could never make out the words. I hadn't heard the whispers myself, but I couldn't deny the way the house felt, like it was alive, watching us. One evening, Rachel was working late, and I decided to do some cleaning. As I vacuumed the hallway, I glanced at the mirror and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me. When I turned around, no one was there. I told Rachel about it when she got home, but she dismissed it, saying I was just tired. A week later, Rachel woke me up in the middle of the night, shaking my shoulder. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then it started, the faint sound of crying coming from the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a woman sobbing softly. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I stepped into the hallway, the crying stopped. The house was silent. Rachel and I barely slept that night. The final incident happened in late August. It was a Saturday evening, and we were sitting in the living room watching TV. The lights flickered, as they often did, but this time they didn't come back on. "Must be a blown fuse," I said, getting up to check the breaker box. As I walked through the dark hallway, I felt a sudden chill. The air was icy, colder than I'd ever felt it in the house. When I reached the breaker box, everything looked normal. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, slow and shallow, right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight, but the hallway was empty. I rushed back to the living room, my heart racing. Rachel was standing near the mirror, staring into it with a blank expression. "Rachel?" I said, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I stepped closer and gently touched her arm. She jolted, blinking rapidly, as if snapping out of a daze. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her face was pale. I thought I saw someone in the mirror," she whispered. That was it. We couldn't take it anymore. The next day, we started looking for a new place. Before we moved, I decided to do some research on the house. What I found was chilling. In the 1940s, a woman named Margaret lived there with her husband. According to old newspaper clippings, Margaret had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. Her husband claimed it was an accident, but neighbors reported hearing arguments and strange noises in the weeks leading up to her death. Rachel and I left the house in September. We didn't take much with us, leaving behind most of the furniture and the mirror. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret's spirit is still there, trapped in that house, pleading for someone to hear her story. I hope the next owners are more prepared than we were. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
In the summer of 2017, my wife, Emily, and I bought a house in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. It was an old craftsman-style home built in the 1920s with a large porch and plenty of room for us and our 2 kids, Olivia and Max. We were thrilled. It was the kind of house Emily had always dreamed of, classic, cozy, and full of potential. The first couple of weeks were spent unpacking and settling in. The kids loved exploring the nooks and crannies, and Emily and I were busy painting rooms and deciding where to hang pictures. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small locked door in the basement. It was about 3 feet high, and when I asked the realtor about it, she shrugged and said the previous owner used it for storage. At first, the house seemed perfect. Quiet nights, friendly neighbors, and a backyard big enough for the kids to play. But as the days passed, little things began to nag at me. It started with Olivia. She was 5 at the time and loved playing in her room. One afternoon, I walked past and heard her talking. I peeked in, expecting to see her playing with her dolls, but she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the corner. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I asked. "My friend," she said without looking at me. "What's your friend's name?" "Her name is Lily," she said simply, then went back to playing. Emily thought it was cute. "Kids have imaginary friends all the time," she said, but something about the way Olivia said it gave me a chill. A few nights later, Emily and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard footsteps upstairs. It was late, and the kids had been asleep for hours. I went to check, but both Olivia and Max were sound asleep in their beds. The footsteps happened again the next night, and the night after that. They always started in the hallway outside the kids' rooms and moved toward the stairs. Then came the voices. Late one night, Emily woke me up, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it sounded like a woman humming. The sound was faint, coming from downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down, my heart pounding. The humming stopped as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The house was silent. Things only got worse from there. Max, who was 3, started waking up crying every night. He said he didn't like the scary lady who came into his room. One afternoon, while cleaning the basement, I decided to take a closer look at the locked door. It seemed odd to have a locked storage area in the house, especially since the realtor hadn't mentioned a key. After some fiddling, I managed to pry it open. Behind the door was a small, dark crawl space. It smelled musty, and the air was thick and cold. In the back corner, I found a wooden box. Inside the box were old photographs and letters. The pictures showed a woman and a little girl, both dressed in 1920s clothing. The letters were addressed to Lillian, and one in particular caught my eye. It was dated 1928 and written by a man named Harold. It was short but chilling. "Lillian, I can't keep her quiet anymore. If anyone finds out, we're ruined." I showed Emily the box and we decided to do some research. What we found was horrifying. In 1928, the house had been owned by Harold and Lillian Mercer. According to local records, their daughter, a 7-year-old named Lily, had died under mysterious circumstances. Some neighbors believed Harold had been abusive, but no charges were ever filed. That night, Emily and I sat in the living room, too shaken to sleep. Around midnight, the humming started again. This time, it was louder, filling the house. Then Olivia screamed. We bolted upstairs and found her standing in the hallway, pointing toward Max's room. "She's in there!" she cried. I ran into Max's room, but it was empty except for him, still asleep in his bed. The air was freezing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. We couldn't stay another night. The next day, we packed up and went to Emily's parents' house. Before we left for good, we hired a paranormal investigator. He spent hours in the house and told us what we already suspected. Something was there. He believed it was Lily, trapped and searching for help. We sold the house at a loss and never looked back. To this day, Olivia still talks about her friend Lily, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we did enough to help her. Story the end.
Story number 9.
In the fall of 2019, my husband Daniel and I bought a house in a quiet suburb outside of Milwaukee. We were newlyweds, eager to start our life together, and this house, a modest ranch-style home built in the 1950s, seemed like the perfect place. It had 3 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and a big backyard. The price was a steal, and we couldn't believe our luck. The first month was spent moving in, unpacking, and getting used to the creaks and groans of an older home. We noticed a few quirks, like the way the basement always felt damp, or how the 3rd bedroom stayed cold no matter how high we turned up the heat, but we chalked it up to the house's age. It wasn't until the 2nd month that we realized something wasn't right. One night, I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the living room. "Daniel?" I called out. No answer. I walked into the living room and found it empty. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, coming from the far wall. I pressed my ear to the wall, wondering if it was a loose pipe, but the sound stopped abruptly. When I told Daniel about it, he laughed. "Old houses are noisy," he said. "It's probably nothing." But the noises didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, we heard tapping, footsteps, and even faint whispers late at night. Daniel started joking that we had a ghost, but I wasn't laughing. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie when the lights flickered. At first, we thought it was a power surge, but then the TV turned off on its own. Daniel grabbed the remote and tried to turn it back on, but the screen stayed black. "Weird," he muttered. As we sat there in silence, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. It was strange because all the windows were closed. "Did you feel that?" I asked. Daniel nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I think we need to check the basement." The basement was the part of the house I hated most. It had a low ceiling, exposed pipes, and a single bare bulb that cast eerie shadows. I followed Daniel down the creaky stairs, my heart pounding. When we reached the bottom, everything looked normal. But as Daniel checked the circuit box, I noticed something odd. There was a small wooden door under the stairs, something I hadn't seen before. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. Daniel turned and frowned. "I don't know. I don't remember seeing it when we moved in." The door was old, its paint peeling, and it had a rusted latch. Daniel tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's probably stuck from the humidity," he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that door. Something about it felt wrong. The next morning, Daniel went to work, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and headed to the basement. The air felt heavier than usual, and the faint smell of mildew made me gag. It took some effort, but I managed to pry the door open. Behind it was a small crawl space filled with old boxes and cobwebs. I shined my flashlight inside and saw something that made my stomach turn. A tattered, stuffed rabbit sitting upright in the middle of the crawl space. I backed away, my hands trembling. That night, I told Daniel what I found. He brushed it off, saying it was probably left behind by the previous owners, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. A few days later, things escalated. I was working from home when I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. Thinking it was Daniel, I called out, "Hey, you're home early." No response. I walked up the stairs, but the hallway was empty. Then I noticed the door to the third bedroom was slightly ajar. "Hello," I said, pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the air was freezing. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror on the closet door, a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. When Daniel came home, I told him everything. He finally admitted that he'd been feeling uneasy too. "I've been hearing whispers," he confessed. "I thought it was just my imagination, but now I'm not so sure." We decided to do some research on the house. What we found was unsettling. In the early 1970s, a little girl named Clara had lived there with her parents. She disappeared one afternoon while playing in the yard, and her body was never found. The case remained unsolved. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the stuffed rabbit in the crawl space. Was it hers? Around 2 a.m., we woke to the sound of loud banging. It was coming from the basement. Daniel grabbed a baseball bat, and we cautiously made our way downstairs. The banging grew louder as we approached the crawl space. When we reached the door, it was wide open. The stuffed rabbit was now sitting at the foot of the stairs. That was the final straw. We packed our bags and stayed in a hotel that night. The next morning, we contacted a paranormal investigator. He spent hours in the house and confirmed what we already suspected. There was a presence there. He believed it was Clara, trapped and unable to move on. We sold the house a month later, taking a financial hit but regaining our peace of mind. Even now, I sometimes think about Clara and wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone to help her. I hope she finds peace someday. Story the end.
Story number 10.
In late 2018, my partner Sarah and I decided to buy our first home together. We had been renting for years, and after many months of searching, we found a house in the outskirts of Kansas City. It was a quaint colonial-style home built in the 1940s with a large front yard and an inviting porch. We were over the moon with excitement. This was the place where we could finally settle down and start a family. The price was reasonable, the neighborhood was quiet, and everything seemed perfect. The first few weeks were uneventful. We spent our days unpacking and decorating. The house was full of charm, old wooden floors, crown molding, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. I remember feeling a sense of comfort as we got to know the house, but soon small things began to happen that I couldn't easily explain. The first sign of something strange was the attic. The house had an old, dusty attic, and we had no plans to use it right away. But one evening, as Sarah and I sat in the living room, we heard what sounded like someone moving around up there. It wasn't a creak or the sound of the house settling, it was deliberate footsteps, slow and cautious. "Did you hear that?" I asked Sarah, my voice tight. Sarah nodded, looking just as confused as I felt. "It's probably just the wind," she said, trying to dismiss it. But even she didn't sound convinced. That night, I went up to check the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the single light bulb in the corner flickered overhead. There was nothing unusual up there, just old storage boxes and forgotten furniture. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the attic was empty. It didn't make sense. The next week, the sounds escalated. At night, we would hear footsteps, whispers, and even what sounded like the faint rustling of someone moving around in the hallways. The noises always came from upstairs, and they seemed to happen when we were at our most vulnerable, just as we were about to fall asleep or when we were in the kitchen, making dinner. One evening, I was in the living room, reading a book while Sarah cooked. The sound of footsteps upstairs became louder, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. "Sarah, I think something's up with the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked over from the kitchen. "Maybe it's just the pipes or something," she suggested, but there was a slight tremor in her voice that I hadn't heard before. That night, things took a more disturbing turn. We were woken by a loud crash. I sat up in bed, adrenaline surging. Sarah was already wide awake, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, slowly getting out of bed and reaching for the flashlight. As we tiptoed down the hall, we found the source of the noise. The porcelain vase that had been sitting on the hallway table was now shattered on the floor. I bent down to pick up the pieces, my hands trembling. "What the hell happened?" Sarah whispered, looking horrified. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But this isn't normal." The next morning, I decided to do some research on the house. It wasn't long before I found something unsettling. The house had a dark history. Back in the 1940s, a woman named Elizabeth had lived there with her husband and young child. Elizabeth was reportedly a quiet woman who kept mostly to herself, but neighbors remembered strange occurrences around her. A few years after they moved in, Elizabeth's husband disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some believed he had left her, but others said he had simply vanished. Elizabeth was never seen again, and her child was placed into foster care. There were rumors that the house was haunted, but they were quickly dismissed as superstition. Sarah and I spent a restless night after learning this. The next morning, I decided to investigate the attic again, hoping to find something that might explain what was happening. This time, I brought a camera, just in case. As I climbed the stairs to the attic, I felt a strange sensation, a cold, oppressive feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I scanned the attic with the flashlight, and then I saw it, a picture frame tucked behind an old trunk. I picked it up, and my stomach dropped. The photograph was black and white, showing a woman standing in front of the house. It was Elizabeth, the same woman I had read about. She was standing in the yard, smiling, but her eyes were empty, almost vacant. That night, Sarah and I were lying in bed when we heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying. It was faint, but it was definitely coming from upstairs where the bedrooms were. We froze, listening intently. "I think it's coming from the attic," I whispered. No, it can't be," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "That's impossible." But it wasn't. We climbed out of bed and slowly made our way up to the attic, flashlight in hand. As we reached the top of the stairs, the crying grew louder. It sounded like a small child, broken, heart-wrenching sobs. We stepped into the attic, and the room felt freezing cold. As I scanned the area with the flashlight, I froze. There, in the far corner of the attic, was a child's toy, a small wooden rocking horse, slowly rocking back and forth on its own. The crying stopped suddenly, and a silence filled the room. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My eyes were drawn to the back wall of the attic. There, etched into the wood, were words, scrawled hastily in what looked like chalk. It read, "Please help me. Mommy, where are you?" Sarah's hand clutched mine, and we turned and ran down the stairs, the chilling sensation of being watched weighing heavily on us. The next day, we contacted a local paranormal investigator. After spending hours in the house, he confirmed what we had feared. The house was indeed haunted, and Elizabeth's spirit, along with the ghost of her child, were still trapped there. The investigator believed that Elizabeth was searching for her missing husband and had unintentionally trapped her child's spirit as well. Sarah and I couldn't stay another night. We moved out of the house that same afternoon, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching us, waiting for us to leave. We sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, it remains uninhabited. Even now, whenever I think back on that time, I can't help but wonder if the spirits of Elizabeth and her child have found peace, or if they are still waiting for someone to help them. The end. In the spring of 2017, my husband Brian and I decided to take the plunge and buy our first home together. We had been renting for a few years, but the constant moving around was starting to wear us down. After months of searching, we found a house just outside of Indianapolis. It was a charming two-story home built in the 1930s, with a large backyard, a wraparound porch, and just enough character to make us fall in love at first sight. The price was reasonable, and we quickly signed the papers. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house had a welcoming feel to it, with beautiful hardwood floors, large windows that let in lots of natural light, and an old-fashioned fireplace in the living room. We spent the first few weeks unpacking, rearranging, and making the space our own. The quiet suburban neighborhood was ideal for us, and we had high hopes for our new life there. But things started to shift after the first month. It was subtle at first, little things that we could dismiss as coincidences or the house settling. Doors would creak open when no one was around, and sometimes we'd hear footsteps upstairs when both of us were downstairs. At night, I began to hear faint whispers, like hushed voices coming from somewhere in the house. I told myself it was just the wind or the house's old pipes, but there was a nagging feeling that something was off. One night, I woke up to a strange sound, a soft tapping coming from the wall next to our bed. At first, I thought it was just a rodent or something small in the walls, but the sound grew louder and more rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking. I nudged Brian, but he was in a deep sleep and didn't stir. The knocking continued for several minutes, then suddenly stopped. I lay there, wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next evening, Brian was in the basement sorting through boxes when I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time coming from upstairs. I called out to him, but there was no response. Thinking it was strange that I hadn't heard him coming up the stairs, I went to check. I found the upstairs empty, the hallway completely still. No one was there. It was around this time that I started having vivid dreams that felt more like memories than mere imagination. I dreamt of a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned dress, standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with hollow eyes. She never spoke, but her presence was suffocating, and I always woke up drenched in sweat. The worst part was that it wasn't just me who felt it. Brian began having strange dreams as well, dreams of a little girl wandering through the house, crying for help. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the living room, I noticed something strange. The room seemed colder than usual, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. I turned around and saw a shadow move across the hallway just beyond the doorframe. I was certain I was alone, so I called out to Brian, but he didn't respond. I walked to the hallway, but when I turned the corner, the shadow was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked back to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The final straw came one afternoon when we were both in the kitchen. We had just finished lunch, and Brian was washing the dishes while I wiped down the counters. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash coming from upstairs. We froze, staring at each other in confusion. "What the hell was that?" Brian asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," I replied, my hands shaking. We ran upstairs to find that a large mirror in the hallway had fallen off the wall and shattered on the floor. There was no explanation for it. It hadn't been knocked over, and there was no reason it should have fallen. But the worst part was the message that had been scratched into the back of the mirror, as if someone had carved it there with a sharp object. It read, "Leave now or stay forever." We were both horrified, and I could see the fear in Brian's eyes. This wasn't just some odd occurrence. It was something much worse. That night, we sat up, talking quietly, trying to make sense of what had been happening. That was when I remembered something: the house's history. I did some research the next day and uncovered a chilling story. In the early 1900s, a family had lived in the house: Charles and Amelia Green and their young daughter, Evelyn. Amelia was known to be a reclusive woman, and the neighbors often spoke of strange noises coming from the house. One night, there was a fire, and the house was nearly destroyed. Amelia and Evelyn were found dead inside, but Charles was never found. The fire had left the house in ruins, and after that, it had changed hands several times before we bought it. When I told Brian about what I found, he was visibly shaken. We both realized that the strange events happening in the house weren't random. The spirits of Amelia and Evelyn were still there, and they weren't content. That night, we called a medium. The woman arrived the next morning, and as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. She walked through the house, her eyes scanning the rooms as she muttered to herself. Finally, she turned to us and spoke in a soft voice. "There is something here," she said. "Two spirits, one angry, one lost. Amelia is still searching for her daughter, and Evelyn, she's trapped in the house, longing for her mother." The medium performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting words that I couldn't understand. Afterward, the house felt lighter, less oppressive, but the unease remained. We stayed in the house for another week, but the disturbances didn't stop. The whispers and footsteps continued, and the oppressive atmosphere never fully lifted. It was clear that we couldn't stay. We moved out the following week, taking as little as possible. The house sat empty for several months before it was sold to another couple. We never told them what we experienced. We didn't want to scare them. But as we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I still wonder if the spirits of Amelia and Evelyn ever found each other. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear a faint whisper in my ear as if someone is trying to tell me their story. Story the end.